Hidden risks in a poorly drafted EOT class. So usually the draft will be made by the employers. The risk always is on the contract. The parties, they think that if the EOT class doesn't have to be discussed at a very early stage when we don't anticipate any delays in this, which is like having a ship without lifeboats. You don't know whether you end up in a delay at EOT class is necessary. But the survey says that 90% of the projects get stuck in delays. So the class that quietly transfers all delay risks. So when the EOT is vague, the employer automatically pushes every delay into the contractor. You end up defending delays that were never US. Here US refers to the contractors. The class becomes a silent liability. The contractor enters the project assuming protection, but the verdict leaves them fully exposed. No clarity means the employer controls the entire narrative. For example, approvals delayed for 3 months, but employer says, we have to take care of the delays. It is not the employer's goods. This is not a joke. There are so many contracts being written where even the employer risk events are being transferred to the contractor risks. That can be challenged where it is against the fair contract laws and it's against the law of these certain jurisdictions where the contracts come up with. No jurisdiction gives the leverage to the employers to transfer their risk to the contractors. Undefined delay categories is equal to endless battles. See, the delays has to be categorized like excusable, non-excusable, compensable, non-compensable. Excusability is based on the time, compensability is based on the cost. So if this is not bifurcated or categorized, every rain delay becomes a discussion. Every shutdown becomes a discussion. There is no reference point. The consultancy interprets everything to their own wishes. For example, a force majeure event treated like a contractor's delay because the class was silent. They will not have a force majeure class and there will not be any clarity on the EOT. This both will give the ambiguity and push the all the liabilities to the contractor. Notice requirements written to file. If the class does not define the notice requirement, for example, when it should be given, what should be written in the notice, and what is the level of detail is required, then a word missed becomes a missed entitlement. The contractors lose claims on technicalities. Employers lose accurate delay records. Both sides operate blindly. For example, a notice given on time but rejected because it wasn't addressed correctly. We have been involved in certain projects where there were the independent engineers or the consultants reject so many notices just because there is no the word of notice in subject. But does the contract says that there should be a word of notice in the subject for notice? No, the notice has to explain that there is an issue or there is a delay that's going to be affect the project completion date. So if it's not defined in the contract and being pushed on the contractor, that will heavily affect the contractor's interim EOTs, cash flows, everything. No connection to the approved program. See, whenever there is an EOT class, the EOT class has to be linkage to the baseline because any change in the baseline program or any effect on the critical path has to be treated as a delay and the contract has to be eligible for an EOT if for the delays not attributable to the contract. For the delays attributable to the contractor, definitely he is exposed to LD. So the class has no logic links, no CPM recognition, no obligation to update. So you cannot prove the delay impact even when the employer caused it or a third party caused it. The contractor shows delay on a Gantt chart, the employer demands a CPM analysis, which is not mentioned in the contract. So they keep on shifting the game. First, there will be, you have to submit delay analysis, then if a delay analysis submitted, no, you should not have followed with this kind of delay analysis, there should be CPM analysis. And if you submitted a CPM analysis, then they will say you should not follow this methodology, you have to follow with some other methodology. Concurrency, silence is equal to arbitrary distress. Most of the contracts are silent on concurrency because the people or the professionals who are drafting the contract doesn't have the understanding of concurrency and its impact. So if concurrency rules are missing, both the parties start arguing about who caused how much delay. The project becomes a blame matrix. Some consultants cut the contractor's EOT by 50% without this. There are so many theories inside the industry that if concurrency you will get only 20%, if concurrency you will get only 40%. There is no guidelines for that. If you are following industry guidelines, you follow industry guidelines. If you are following any international standards like SCL and AAC, you have to follow. So others reject the entire claim when the class is silent. But of course, at the end, if the dispute goes to arbitration, the arbitrator has to take a decision and they decide based on the factual availabilities of the damages being visible to the contract. For example, the contractor has 20 days delay and the employer has 20 days delay. The consultant gives EOT is equal to 0. Which is a very wrong statement that not necessarily both has to be fall on the same critical path, not necessarily both has, just because both occur in the same timeline, they become concurrent. The understanding of the concurrency and the depth of the concurrency should be very clear in the contract. No defined method of delay analysis. A clause that doesn't specify prospective or retrospective analysis gives full power to the employer. The employees pick the method that reduces entitlement. Contractor jumps between methods trying to fit the case. There is no consistent approach. No industry standard reference. Example, the employee demands retrospective analysis at project end, even though delay analysis were notified monthly. See, usually in project execution, the contractor goes with prospective analysis. They don't do retrospective analysis. Most of the contractors doesn't have exposure to retrospective analysis because their motive is to complete the project on time, and their purpose of EOT is to find the actual date of completion or forecasted date of completion when the delay is being ongoing. Very rarely contractors who have exposure towards dispute resolutions, arbitrations, they understand retrospective analysis because retrospective analysis is kind of a postmortem that is usually done after the end of the project. So between these arguments, your EOT will get stuck. No interim EOT is equal to LD pressure for years. Not just LD pressures. The employer will start recovering the LD when there is no interim EOT. So the cash flow suffers immediately. Bank guarantees get stuck. Subcontractors panic. The contractor fights pressure instead of focusing on the progress. For example, the project delayed 18 months due to no interim relief. LD threat continues till final completion. Not just LD threat continues. They will start recovering the LD. Time becomes at large without anyone realizing. So if there is no EOT approved and the project completion date has been exceeded already, both the parties don't know when the project is going to be completed. That is the time exactly when time becomes large. When time becomes large, even though the law gives more privilege to the contractor than the employer, but still inside the industry, this is a threat for the contractor. And because he works in a way that he don't know when the delay is going to be stopped, and he don't know when he has to complete the project and get out of his resources from the project. The contractor gets unlimited time. Employer loses LD rights. This usually happens silently through vague drafting. It creates major commercial imbalances. I have specifically worked on projects as a consultant where the project is 3 years and it took 13 years to complete. We have worked on it. So, for example, the engineer takes 8 months to decide EOT and LD becomes unenforceable. Time granted, cost ignored. This is an usual game played by all the employers. They say that, okay, you have an EOT, you are asking for a prolongation cost. No, we don't give cost. We don't levy LD on you and you don't ask prolongation cost. This is a very, very normal argument in settlement meetings between the employers and contractors, which doesn't have any base. So when the clause separates time from the cost without clarity, it triggers automatic disputes. The employer gives time but refuses prolongation cost. Contractor argues both are linked. Both sides enter a deadlock and it stops the cash flow and stops the entire project mobility. Employer grants 60 days EOT but rejects preliminary and overrides because not mentioned. See, this is a very interesting scenario where employers grant EOT for employer risk events. For example, there is a delay in site access, delay in drawings, delay in uh, authority approvals or permits to enter the site facilities. But they reject the cost for those events. The employees don't understand that these kind of interim EOTs or EOTs without cost will not stand in front of arbitrators, because the EOT granted was granted for an employer risk event for which the employer is entitled to pay the contractor. So no early dispute triggers. If the class does not have any early warnings or escalation levels, the dispute keeps growing in the background silently. But at the end of the project, it explodes. Parties run out of negotiation space, and the important professionals will not be there. They would have moved out to the other projects. The smallest delay has become now an arbitration claim. Time and cost of both the parties increase unnecessarily. For example, delay not discussed for 1 year, it escalates directly. It will not discuss, but it will be staying silent on the progress presentations or progress reports. One day it will explode and it will end up in disputes. So I think this presentation would have given you an idea of why we have to draft a strong EOT class. If it's not being drafted strongly, it has a heavy risk on the contractor side than the employee side. Of course, employer also has risks. So if you want to discuss on any particular topics, please drop the comment. Thanks for watching. See you later. Take care.